My mother said 7 words to me that I will never forget. Don't come home this year. Your sister doesn't want you there. Just like that. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my own mother told me not to come home. Not because the house was full, not because something had happened, but because my sister didn't want drama. I remember standing in my tiny Boston apartment, staring at my packed suitcase. By the door, my plane ticket was already booked. My gifts were wrapped. I had been looking forward to that dinner for weeks, and in less than 10 seconds, I realized something painful. I wasn't being uninvited from Thanksgiving. I was being erased from my own family. So that year, I spent Thanksgiving completely alone. Just me, a quiet restaurant, and a table full of strangers laughing together while I tried not to cry over a plate of turkey. But what happened next is something I could never have predicted, because the strangers sitting at the table beside me that night would eventually become the people I call Mom and Dad. And 5 years later, on the happiest day of my life, my biological parents showed up uninvited to my wedding. They stood in the back of the room, watching another couple walk me down the aisle, watching an entire crowd applaud as the MC proudly announced, "Please welcome the parents of the bride." Except it wasn't them. And the moment my mother realized what had happened, the look on her face was something I will never forget. Before I tell you how everything led to that moment, take a second to subscribe to the channel. That way, if life gets busy and you can't finish this story today, you'll be able to come back and find it again, along with many other powerful stories about family resilience and second chances. And I want to ask you something. If your own family told you not to come home for the holidays, what would you do? Would you forgive them? Or, would you start building a new life without them? Because the night my family shut the door on me was the night I unknowingly walked into the family that would change my life forever. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old now. But the story I'm about to tell you really began long before that phone call. Because the truth is, the Thanksgiving invitation wasn't the first time my family chose my sister over me. Not even close. In my family, there were always 2 roles. My older sister, Natalie, was the golden child. And somehow, without anyone ever saying it out loud, I became the problem. Natalie was 3 years older than me. She was confident, loud, charming in that effortless way some people are. Teachers loved her. My parents adored her. When Natalie walked into a room, it felt like the whole house revolved around her. And when I walked into a room, well, I mostly tried not to take up too much space. I learned that lesson pretty early. I still remember my 16th birthday. I had planned it for weeks. Nothing big. Just a small bowling party with a few friends from school. My mom had even bought a chocolate cake from my favorite bakery. But that morning, Natalie called the house in tears. She had just failed a calculus exam in college. Suddenly, everything changed. My mom spent the entire morning on the phone comforting her. My dad drove across town to bring her lunch. By the afternoon, my birthday party was quietly canceled. My mom patted my shoulder and said, "Don't be dramatic, Emma. Your sister really needs us today. We'll celebrate next weekend." But we never did. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Families have emergencies. People get busy. I tried to be understanding. But moments like that kept happening. When I graduated from college, I was the first person in my family to do it with honors. I had worked nights at a cafe to pay my tuition. I studied until 2 in the morning most days. That graduation meant everything to me. But when I walked across the stage and looked into the crowd, my parents weren't there. Their seats were empty. They showed up almost 2 hours later. Natalie had a prenatal doctor appointment that morning, and apparently it couldn't be rescheduled. My mom hugged me and said, "Sweetheart, you understand, right? Natalie's pregnancy is more important than a ceremony. More important than me." That sentence stayed with me for years. The strange thing is, I stopped arguing after a while. Every time I tried to explain how I felt, the response was always the same. Emma, you're too sensitive. Why do you always make everything about yourself? Your sister just has more going on in her life right now. Eventually, I learned something very important. If I stayed quiet, things were easier. So I became the easy daughter, the quiet one, the one who apologized first, even when I didn't know what I had done wrong. I shrank myself in ways I didn't even realize at the time. Smaller expectations, smaller voice, smaller place in the family. And for years, I convinced myself that if I was patient enough, good enough, agreeable enough, maybe one day my parents would finally choose me too. But that phone call, 3 days before Thanksgiving, changed something. Standing there in my apartment with the cold Boston wind rattling the windows, I called my father. Part of me still believed he would fix it. "Hey, kiddo," he answered. "Dad," I said carefully. "Did Mom tell you what she said?" A long pause followed. "I heard about it," he replied. My heart started beating faster. "So, you're okay with this? You think it's normal that I'm not allowed to come home for Thanksgiving?" Another pause. I could hear a football game playing on the television behind him. "You know how your mother is," he said quietly. "She's just trying to keep the peace by excluding me." "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Dad?" Silence. I swallowed and asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for years. "Do you want me there?" 5 seconds passed, then 10. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I think maybe it's better if you listen to your mother this year." Something inside me went very still. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just said, "Okay, Dad," and then I hung up the phone. That was the moment I understood something I had spent my whole life avoiding. I wasn't just the daughter who caused drama. In my family, I was the one who could be sacrificed. And for the first time in 27 years, I started to wonder what life might look like if I stopped begging for a seat at their table. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and quiet. I woke up in my small Boston apartment to the sound of footsteps in the hallway and muffled laughter coming from the apartment upstairs. Someone's family had arrived early. I could hear children running across the floor and a woman calling out from the kitchen. For a moment, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. My phone was silent. No messages. No happy Thanksgiving. Not even a short text from my parents. Around noon, I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Snow had started to fall, covering the sidewalks in a thin, white layer. Across the street, I watched a couple helping their elderly mother into a car. They were all laughing about something. It looked warm, familiar, safe. The kind of moment people don't even realize is special until they don't have it anymore. I made the mistake of opening Instagram. The very first post on my feed was from my sister, Natalie. A bright, cheerful photo of my parents, Natalie, her husband, and their toddler sitting around the Thanksgiving table. Everyone was smiling. The caption read, "So grateful for my beautiful family this year." I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were 5 chairs at the table, 4 adults, 1 child. No empty seat. They hadn't just asked me not to come. They had already replaced me. I closed the app and set my phone down slowly. For a while, I considered doing what most people probably would have done. Ordering takeout, turning on the TV, pretending it was just another Thursday. But something inside of me resisted that idea. If I was going to spend Thanksgiving alone, I didn't want to do it sitting in the dark. So I grabbed my coat and walked outside into the cold afternoon. After wandering through a few quiet streets, I found one of the few restaurants still open that day. It was a small, old-fashioned place called Riverside Grill. Inside the room was warm and glowing with soft lights. The smell of roasted turkey and fresh bread filled the air. Nearly every table was full of families and friends enjoying their holiday meal. The hostess greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "Just one?" she asked. I nodded. She led me to a small table in the corner, right beside a large group that had pushed several tables together. 3 generations sat there. Grandparents, parents, children, all talking over each other in the comfortable way families do. I tried not to look at them. My Thanksgiving plate arrived a few minutes later. Turkey mashed potatoes, stuffing cranberry sauce. Everything perfectly arranged. But I barely touched it. I kept hearing their laughter beside me. At one point, the youngest child told a joke so bad the entire table groaned at the same time. And somehow, that's when the tears came. Quietly at first. I turned toward the window and wiped my face with my napkin, hoping no one would notice. But someone did. A gentle voice beside me said, "Honey, are you all right?" I looked up. An older woman with kind eyes was standing next to my table. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and she had the warmest expression I had ever seen from a complete stranger. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just allergies." She raised one eyebrow slightly. Allergies usually don't make people cry on Thanksgiving. Despite everything, I let out a small, embarrassed laugh. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's paying attention," she said softly. She glanced back toward the large table behind her, then looked at me again. "My name is Margaret," she said, "and no one should spend Thanksgiving alone." I immediately shook my head. "Oh, I couldn't. I don't want to interrupt your family dinner." "You wouldn't be interrupting," she said. "You'd be joining." Behind her, a man with gray hair raised his glass toward me. "That's my wife inviting you," he called out with a friendly grin. "Trust me, she never says things she doesn't mean." A younger man, sitting across from him, laughed. "It's true. Resistance is pretty much useless." I looked back at my untouched plate of food, then at their table, where people were already shifting chairs to make space. For a moment, I hesitated. Then Margaret reached out and gently touched my shoulder. "Come sit with us," she said. "There's always room for one more." And without realizing it, I stood up. I had no idea that the small decision I made in that moment would change the entire direction of my life. The moment I sat down at their table, something strange happened. No one treated me like a stranger. There were no awkward silences, no uncomfortable questions, no polite smiles that people use when they're trying to be nice, but secretly wishing you would leave. Instead, someone immediately passed me a warm dinner roll. Another person poured me a glass of wine, and the man with the gray hair leaned forward and said warmly, "Well, now that you're officially here, we should probably introduce ourselves." He extended his hand across the table. "I'm Thomas Hayes." He gestured toward the woman who had invited me over. "This is my wife, Margaret." Then he began pointing around the table one by one. "Our oldest son, Daniel, his wife, Rachel, their 2 kids, and that troublemaker over there is our youngest, Luke." Luke raised his glass slightly and gave me a friendly smile. "And you must be," Emma Margaret said. I blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "You look like someone who needed a seat at the table," she said gently. That was enough. For the next 2 hours, something unexpected happened. I relaxed. The conversation flowed easily. They asked about my work as a graphic designer. The kids told ridiculous stories about their school projects. Thomas attempted 3 terrible turkey jokes in a row, and every single one of them somehow made the entire table laugh. At one point, I caught myself laughing too. A real laugh. Not the polite kind I used with clients or coworkers. The kind that came from deep inside. The kind that surprised even me. And for a brief moment, I forgot that I had arrived at that restaurant feeling completely alone. Later that evening, after the main plates had been cleared and pie had been served, Margaret quietly moved her chair next to mine. She spoke softly so the others couldn't hear. "Are you feeling a little better now?" I nodded. "Yes, actually, I really am." She studied my face for a moment, the way someone does when they truly want to understand. Then she asked gently, "Do you want to tell me why you were crying earlier?" For a second, I considered brushing it off, but something about Margaret made it hard to pretend. So I told her the truth, about the phone call, about my sister, about the empty chair that never existed at my family's table. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she simply nodded slowly. "You know," she said quietly, I spent 30 years working as a family counselor. I looked up, surprised. I saw many families who looked perfect from the outside, she continued. But behind closed doors, someone was always being blamed for things they didn't cause. Her eyes softened. And it's almost always the same person. The quiet one, the one who tries the hardest, the one who keeps asking for fairness. Her hand rested lightly on mine. Let me tell you something important, Emma. You are not the problem. Those words hit me harder than anything else she could have said, because no one had ever said them to me before. Not once in my entire life. Before we left the restaurant that night, Margaret handed me a small card with her address written on the back. Sunday dinners, she said with a warm smile. Every week. You're welcome anytime. I didn't go the following Sunday, or the one after that. I told myself it would be too strange, too forward, too much like I was intruding. But Margaret called me a few weeks later, not to pressure me, just to ask how I was doing. And eventually, curiosity won. The first time I walked up the steps of the Hayes family home, I stood on their porch for nearly 5 minutes before knocking. The house itself looked like something from a storybook. A large, welcoming place with warm lights glowing in every window. Margaret opened the door before I even finished knocking. There you are, she said, with a smile, pulling me into a hug like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside the house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. And just like that, Sunday dinners became part of my life. Weeks turned into months. Months slowly turned into years. Thomas taught me how to play chess at the kitchen table. Even though I lost nearly every game, Margaret shared her secret recipes with me. Daniel's kids began calling me Aunt Emma without anyone ever telling them to. And Luke became my closest friend. We talked for hours after dinner, sometimes sitting on the back porch long after everyone else had gone inside. About books, about dreams, about the strange ways life can surprise you. One evening, almost 2 years after that first Thanksgiving, Luke asked me to meet him for dinner. When I arrived, I realized he had chosen the same restaurant where we first met. Riverside Grill. I wanted to come back to where everything started, he said, with a nervous smile. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. Emma, he said softly, I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you. A small velvet box appeared in his hand, and before I could even process what was happening, Luke Hayes asked me to marry him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be loved. I was simply being chosen. Wedding planning, as it turns out, is both wonderful and overwhelming. There are flowers to choose, venues to visit, menus to taste, music guest lists, decorations, dozens of small decisions that somehow turn into hundreds, too. But for me, there was one question that kept returning again and again. A single line on the wedding invitations. It seems like such a small detail, just a few printed words. But for me, it felt impossibly heavy. At the top of every formal invitation, there's a traditional line. Parents of the bride. I remember sitting at the Hayes kitchen table one evening, staring down at a sample invitation the printer had sent us. Luke was on the other side of the room, measuring table layouts with a tape measure. Margaret was flipping through flower arrangements, but I couldn't focus on any of that. My eyes kept drifting back to that one empty space. Parents of the bride. For a moment, I thought about writing my biological parents' names, George and Linda Carter, but the thought made something in my chest tighten. They hadn't called me in nearly 2 years. Not on my birthday, not on Christmas, not once. And yet somehow, tradition expected their names to sit proudly on that invitation. It didn't feel honest. Margaret must have noticed my expression, because she gently sat down beside me. What's troubling you, sweetheart? I showed her the invitation. I don't know what to put here, I admitted quietly. Margaret studied the blank line for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. You know, there is another option. I looked up. What do you mean? She folded her hands calmly. There is a legal process called adult adoption. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Adult adoption. Margaret nodded. It allows someone to formally become part of a family even as an adult. New legal records, new next of kin status, everything. My heart started beating faster. That's actually possible. Very possible, she said. And it happens more often than people think. I looked across the room at Thomas, who was now arguing playfully with Luke about where the dance floor should go. These people had welcomed me into their lives without hesitation. They had fed me, listened to me, loved me. But still, the idea felt enormous. Margaret said softly, "Would you and Thomas ever consider something like that?" Before I could finish the sentence, she wrapped her arms around me. "We've considered you our daughter since the day you sat down at that restaurant table," she whispered. "We were simply waiting for you to be ready." The adoption process took several months. There were court documents, legal filings, interviews, and signatures. But strangely, none of it felt complicated. In fact, it felt like something that had already happened in our hearts long before the paperwork began. The day the judge finalized everything, Margaret cried openly. Thomas cleared his throat several times and pretended he had something in his eye. And just like that, Emma Carter officially became Emma Hayes. For the first time in my life, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not excitement, not relief, something quieter, belonging. When we sent out the wedding invitations, a few weeks later, the blank line was no longer empty. It read, "Parents of the bride, Thomas and Margaret Hayes." I should have known my biological family would eventually find out. 3 months before the wedding, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I hadn't seen in years. "Natalie." The message was short. "I heard you're getting married." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I blocked the number. A few days later, my mother called 5 times in one afternoon. I didn't answer. Finally, a text arrived. "Why didn't you tell us about your wedding? We're your family. Call me immediately." I read it once, then deleted it. 3 years of silence. And suddenly, they remembered I existed. I thought that would be the end of it. But one Tuesday afternoon, as I was working from home, reviewing design proofs on my laptop, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my mother was standing in the hallway. She looked older than I remembered, but the expression on her face was exactly the same. Disapproval. "Emma," she said sharply, stepping inside before I could respond. "What do you think you're doing?" I closed the door slowly. "What do you mean? Getting married without telling your own parents?" she snapped. I folded my arms. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. That was one Thanksgiving," she said dismissively. "You're still upset about that?" I felt a strange calm settle over me. "I'm not upset anymore," I said. "I've moved on." Her eyes scanned my apartment. They stopped on the framed photos on my bookshelf. Pictures of me and Luke, pictures of Sunday dinners, pictures of the Hayes family Christmas. Her voice tightened. "Who are these people?" I met her gaze calmly. "My family." Her face twisted with disbelief. "I am your family." "You were," I said quietly. Then I opened the front door. "And you're not invited to the wedding." As she stood there staring at me, in stunned silence, one thought crossed my mind. I had a feeling this wasn't the last time I would see her before the wedding day. The morning of my wedding arrived warm and bright. The ceremony was being held at a vineyard just outside Napa Valley, surrounded by rolling hills and endless rows of green vines. The air smelled like fresh flowers in summer sunlight. Inside the bridal suite, Margaret stood behind me, gently adjusting my veil. "You look beautiful," she said softly. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked calm, steady, almost peaceful. Very different from the girl who had once sat alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving, wondering why her own family didn't seem to want her. On the table beside the mirror lay the wedding program. I picked it up and read the line I had struggled with months before. "Parents of the bride, Thomas and Margaret Hayes." Margaret noticed where I was looking. Her eyes softened. "No matter what happens today," she said quietly, placing her hands on my shoulders, "remember this. You are loved." I turned and hugged her tightly. "I know," I whispered. Outside the window, guests were beginning to arrive. The ceremony would start in less than 30 minutes. Luke was already waiting near the altar. It was time. The ceremony itself was everything I had ever hoped for. Thomas walked me down the aisle, his arms steady and proud. Luke's smile grew wider with every step I took toward him. The guests watched quietly, many of them wiping tears from their eyes as we exchanged our vows. When the officiant finally said the words, "You may kiss the bride," the entire crowd erupted in applause. For a moment, everything felt perfect. But the moment that changed everything came during the reception. Music was playing softly. Guests were laughing and talking over dinner when a member of the security team approached me discreetly. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "there are 2 people at the entrance, claiming to be your parents." My stomach tightened slightly. I had expected this. Luke appeared beside me almost instantly. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'll handle it." After a moment of thought, I gave the guard a simple instruction. "Let them in, but seat them in the back." A few minutes later, I saw them. My mother and father stood near the entrance of the reception hall, looking around uncertainly at the 100 guests celebrating the wedding they had never been invited to. Then the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "before we continue the celebration, we'd like to introduce 2 very special people." Across the room, my mother straightened slightly. I could almost see her preparing herself to stand, preparing to accept the recognition she believed belonged to her. The MC continued, "Please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride." A pause filled the room. Then he smiled broadly and announced, "Thomas and Margaret Hayes." The entire room erupted in applause. Thomas and Margaret stood from their seats at the head table smiling as the guests cheered and clapped for them. Across the reception hall, my mother's face turned completely pale. She grabbed my father's arm. "What did he just say?" she whispered. My father didn't answer. They were both staring at the same thing now, Margaret hugging me proudly, Thomas raising a glass toward the crowd. To everyone in that room, it was perfectly normal. Of course they were my parents, but my biological parents knew the truth. My mother pushed her way through the crowd until she reached me. Her voice was sharp and furious. "What is going on?" I met her eyes calmly. "My legal parents," I said simply. "I was adopted 2 years ago." Her mouth fell open. "You can't just replace us." "I didn't replace you," I said quietly. "You left first." Guests nearby had begun to notice the tension. My father stepped forward slowly, his voice trembling. "Emma, I'm sorry." I looked at him carefully. For the first time in my life, he actually looked ashamed. "I should have stood up for you," he said. "I should have done something years ago." His words hung in the air between us, but they came too late. "I believe you're sorry," I said gently, "but sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent trying to earn your love." Margaret stepped beside me, then resting a comforting hand on my arm. My mother glared at her. "You stole our daughter," she snapped. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm enough to silence the entire room. "No, ma'am," he said. "We didn't steal anything." He looked directly at her. "You gave her away." The words hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. 5 years ago, Thomas continued, "Your daughter was sitting alone on Thanksgiving because her own family told her not to come home. My wife invited her to our table. We didn't take her from you." He paused. "We simply treated her like she mattered." The security staff stepped forward quietly, and moments later, my biological parents were escorted out of the reception hall. As the doors closed behind them, the room slowly filled with applause. Not for the drama, for something much simpler. For the moment, a woman finally chose the family that had chosen her first. If you step back and look at this story from the outside, there is something important happening beneath the surface. For many years, Emma believed the problem was her. She believed she was too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult. And sadly, that belief is very common. As someone who has studied family dynamics for many years, I can tell you that in many families, there is often an invisible role assigned to one person. Sometimes there is a golden child, the one everyone protects. And sometimes there is a scapegoat, the one who quietly carries the blame for everything that goes wrong. The scapegoat is often the child who asks questions, the one who notices unfairness, the one who refuses to pretend that everything is fine. But here is the truth most people don't realize. The scapegoat is rarely the problem. More often, they are simply the first person brave enough to stop playing along. Emma's story is not really about revenge. It's about boundaries. And boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of self-respect. When Emma stopped begging for a seat at a table where she was never truly welcome, something extraordinary happened. She found another table, one where people made room for her, one where kindness replaced silence, one where love was given freely instead of earned through suffering. And that is the real lesson here. Family is not just biology. Family is behavior. Family is the people who show up, the people who listen, the people who make sure there is always a chair waiting for you. Years later, Emma would look back on that lonely Thanksgiving and realize something surprising. It wasn't the worst day of her life. It was the day her real life finally began. Because if her family had never closed that door, she might never have walked into the restaurant where another family was waiting to open theirs. And sometimes, the most painful moments in our lives are not endings at all. They are redirections. They guide us away from places where we are tolerated and toward people who truly see our worth. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to like this video. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience and the surprising ways life can change when we least expect it, consider subscribing to the channel as well. That way, you won't miss the next story. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone in your own family? Was it difficult? Or did it eventually bring you peace? You can share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the stories we tell each other are exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if there is one thing Emma's journey reminds us of, it's this: you deserve to be chosen, not as an afterthought, not as a last option, but as someone who matters exactly as you are.